Welcome everybody to webinar 9 in the Inclusive Martial Arts webinar series. My name is Shannon. I work at the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Physical Education, Recreation, Sport and Fitness. And this webinar series is being brought to you by the UNESCO ICM, which is the International Center of Martial Arts for Youth Development and Engagement in South Korea. So as I said, this is webinar 9 and the theme of which is the inclusion of women and girls in martial arts. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you here today. We have a fantastic panel of experts from various domains and that have a lot of expertise and experience on the topic of gender inclusion or the inclusion of women and girls in martial arts. And so to start, I'm going to give a very I'll introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll be moving into three very distinct topics. So the topics they're going to be covering today are 1, the recruitment and retention, 2, coaching women and girls, and then 3, pathways for women in leadership. And so to start, our first panelists, and not in any particular order, the order of how I'm seeing them here on my screen. So we have Dr. Anna Kavura. She's a sports psychology specialist and postdoctoral fellow at the School of Sport and Health Science at the University of Brighton. Then we have Dr. Anne Chundo, national champion in women's boxing and associate professor of sports sociology at Nord University in Norway. We have Dr. Chloe Mclean, and national karate champion and lecturer in sociology at the University of West Scotland. And last but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Alex Shannon, who's a principal lecturer in physical education and sports studies at the University of Brighton. So welcome to all of our panelists. We're so thrilled that you said yes to joining us here and to share your expertise. I also want to welcome all of our attendees that are here with us live today, but also all of those who are listening to the recording. These recordings are going to be available on the UNESCO Chair's YouTube channel, as well as UNESCO ICM's YouTube channel as well. And so let's start and hear a little bit more about each of our panelists. So Dr. Kavura, can you share a little bit more about yourself and your expertise, please?
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you, asking for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this. This is very exciting. If I can, regarding my martial arts experience, if I can say like a little bit more, I guess I identify as a martial arts enthusiast, and I have tried many different disciplines over the years. But my main sport, I guess, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in which I hold like a black belt, and I have been doing it for more than 15 years. And also judo, I have been doing for several years and till I reached the brown belt level. And my research interests are very much connected. My research interest on gender is very much connected with my personal experiences of training, like instructing and competing in like martial arts spaces that are usually dominated by men. And also like informed by my experiences as a Greek woman traveling around. Like I have been living in like countries like Finland, Denmark, South Korea for a while, and Brazil and UK. So I had to adapt to many different like ways of organizing martial arts, but also of like different cultural understandings in relation to my gender and sport. So my views on inclusion of girls and women are very much informed from this cultural lens.
Thank you, Dr. Kavura, and it's lovely to have you with us. I look forward to hearing more from you. And so Dr. Chindal, can you share a little bit more about yourself, I should say, and your expertise and personal experience?
Yes, of course. I always say that I was a boxer before I became a researcher. So I started boxing when I was 16 years old, and I just fell in love with the sport. So I don't really have much experience with other martial arts. I did try kickboxing for a little while, but boxing is the sport that's where my passion is. So Yeah, I boxed on the national team for a few years, became a national champion, and slowly, as my career in university started to take off, I started to scale down the boxing and transitioned into leadership. So I'm currently the head coach of something called Norway Female Box, which is the Women and Girls Inclusion Program for the Norwegian Boxing Federation. I'm the current vice president of the Norwegian Boxing Federation as the first woman and the youngest ever to hold the position. And I just got elected into the coaching committee in the International Boxing Federation. So I have quite a bit of experience with leadership in different areas. Yeah, so I guess that would be, as of now, my perspectives are mainly the coach and more the leadership aspect of martial arts.
Fantastic, Dr. Chundal. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing a lot more about the pathways for women in leadership that you're going to share about shortly. And Dr. Chloe Mclean, welcome.
Hi, thanks very much for having me here today, and thanks for the really kind introduction. So I've been doing karate for nearly 25 years now. I now currently have stopped competing, but I have moved on to coaching karate, and I'm also a director for Women and Girls Interests for the Scottish Karate Governing Body. In terms of my research on gender in martial arts, most of my research is focused on the sport of karate. And what I'm really interested in is the ways in which practice in martial arts can challenge or reinforce conventional ideas about gender and conventional ways in which we use our bodies in gendered ways, or how it can challenge those gendered ways that we use our bodies. But really looking forward to being part of this panel today. I think it's going to be really brilliant.
Thank you, Dr. McLean. Yeah, me too. It's going to be great. I can hear already. And I'm sure all of our attendees viewing, as I said, live or even watching the recording, you're getting an idea of what's in store here, hearing from each of our panelists already so far. And Dr. Shannon, can you share a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Thanks, Aisling. Yeah, and thank you for having me along today. It's really a great privilege to join you folks and to be talking about this topic. So with respect to my background, I've been training in martial arts since about 2004. I trained in freestyle kickboxing, in Kung Fu for quite a few years, karate as well. I tried Aikido, and more recently I've been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I've trained in a fair few different martial arts and have loved combining, like the other panelists, combining the practical experience of doing martial arts and being a martial artist with academic research. So my first sort of real foray into social science in sport was looking at gender in martial arts, particularly around men and women who train together in martial arts, and how, as Chloe mentioned, some of the gendered ways of being and living through your body, how that can in many ways create problems in martial arts contexts where men and women are coming up against each other, doing something which they very rarely do in regular social life, which is punch and kick each other purposefully and for fun. So my first study was to try and understand this and how people make sense of it and what kind of problems it creates when we do this together and how people get around those problems. I've also been very interested in how the media represent martial arts from a gendered point of view, particularly how female martial artists and female combat athletes are represented in the media. Beyond gender, I've also done research on topics like violence and consent education and medical care as well, most recently in combat sport. So I've got a very broad academic interest in martial arts generally, but gender was the first thing that I looked at properly. So it's always been quite close to my heart. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, and I'll stop my introduction there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon. I'm so excited. As each of you were speaking, I'm getting really excited for this conversation. I know it's going to be really good. And so I'm also going to share in the chat, everybody, so the Twitter handles for each of our panelists here. And for those of you who, if you're watching the recording, there'll be a slide at the very, very end where you can access this information as well. And what I really like what you said there, Dr. Shannon, about each of you, you have a strong, your own personal experience with martial arts, whichever the martial art it is that you're practicing. And there's even a diversity amongst each of you as well. And then obviously then you're strong, very strong academic background, you know, you're all very well published as well. And so I encourage each of you, our attendees, to check out and connect with the panelists and follow the work that they're doing, especially if you're interested in this topic. So let us get started in the conversation. So we're going to start, as I said, there's 3 different topics. And so Dr. Kavura is going to start the conversation with topic 1 on recruitment and retention. So take it away, Dr. Kavura, whenever you're ready.
So I'm gonna share my screen. I have prepared a few slides. Share. And can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, great. So I have the privilege to start this webinar with the topic of recruiting and retaining more women and girls in martial arts and combat sports. And despite incremental increases in the numbers of women and girls who train in martial arts and combat sports, most spaces continue to be dominated by men. So recruiting and retaining women and girls seems to be a persisting challenge. To understand why this is happening, many scholars have looked at the underlying reasons for that, including the speakers today, and focusing on identifying the possible barriers and constraints. And today, we have a growing body of research that reveals persisting challenges, such as gender stereotypes, for example, the belief that the perceptions of the female body is more fragile and less capable for certain activities, such as fighting and martial arts. Cultural expectations that are also gendered, like, for example, research shows that women are more likely to discontinue their sports or martial art career due to cultural expectations to succeed in other fields of life, such as education, for example, or like making a family. Women who practice martial arts are also constrained by gender hierarchies and unequal distribution of power and resources, as identities and characteristics that are seen as male and masculine are more celebrated in martial arts and are offered more respect, space, and resources. And of course, this leads to a lack of opportunities for women. For example, it is harder for women to imagine a professional career in martial arts as athletes or coaches than it is for men. It might be also harder to find suitable training partners and high-level coaching. And let's not forget that it is only like a few decades ago that women have been allowed access to the highest level of martial arts, for example, in the Olympic Games for those disciplines that are in the Olympic program. So in turn, this also leads to a lack of representation, lack of female role models, and a lack of media coverage. And when female martial artists are presented in the media, their bodies and experiences are often trivialized or even sexualized. Moreover, research based on interviews with female martial artists reveals experiences of interpersonal or institutional discrimination and harassment and sexism in their everyday martial art practices. And while this is not an exhaustive list of barriers, I think it is important to take these issues into consideration when planning our recruitment and retention strategies. It is important to consider, for example, which of the aforementioned barriers or other barriers that might not be included in my list might be relevant to the anti-representation of women and girls in our martial art context, in our national context, in our federation, or in our club culture. Is there anything that could be done in the federation level or in the club level or in our every day-to-day practices in order to tackle these issues? Identifying and addressing the specific issues that may be hurting our clubs or federations' ability to recruit and retain women and girls is an important first step. Because the truth is that when it comes to recruitment and retention, there is no one-size-fits-all recipe that would work for all. So our strategies, policies, or interventions need to take into account the specific needs that are relevant in our cultural context. And in my next and last slide, I have listed a few examples of strategies that I have seen over the years being used in various clubs that I have trained or researched. However, as I said, there is no magic recipe really. So everything needs to be adapted to the specifics of the context, and something that works for one club might not work for another at all. So I just offer these examples as ideas to consider. And the first one, like one very popular strategy that I have seen in many clubs, is women's only trainings. That I could be talking for hours about the advantages and disadvantages of these strategies, because I have, in addition to my research, I have been myself involved in several such initiatives. But just in short, I would like to say that I have seen women's only classes being a success in recruitment and retention when the idea is not to separate women from men, but instead it is to offer this as a first step for women's integration into the mixed gender training, until, for example, they get used to the contact and the techniques of the sport in an environment that they feel safe, and or to offer more training opportunities for the higher level practitioners. For example, in women-only training camps, it is easier to find partners of the same weight category, and possibly you can prepare better for competition if you compete. So the idea is to offer more opportunities for training, not to separate. On the other hand, I have many times seen women's only trainings failing when they are based on gender stereotypes, such as that women are not capable of intense training or of training together with men, and they need to be offered some lighter form of training or something closer to fitness than to fighting. But I guess it really depends on the context. And such initiatives are more successful when they are run by women themselves, or when women are involved in the decision making, and when they are given space in general in their club and in the federation to make decisions, to get involved in the administration, in coaching and leadership duties. Having women in decision making positions, hiring female coaches, and promoting or sponsoring the careers of female athletes can eliminate some of the inequalities and barriers that we discussed before, and offer more female role models for other women and girls to look up to. Yet, an increase in the numbers of females in positions of power alone is not always enough, as we women ourselves, we often also end up reproducing gender stereotypes. So we need education for all those involved in martial arts and combat sports on how to recognize gender inequalities and gender-based discrimination, and how to prevent and tackle these problems. We also need education on how to better support the participation and martial arts career development of women and girls. For example, coaching tools, like handbooks and seminars could help. And of course, incorporating a safe sport policy and making sure that our training environment is free from discrimination, harassment and abuse is a very essential step for retaining and also enhancing the positive experiences of all our practitioners. So in closing, I would like to open the floor for additional comments or questions if our expert speakers have something else to add on this topic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for that presentation. And, just before any questions come in there, I'm so present to the similarities. My background is more in the inclusion of people with disabilities, and how, so there's the same themes that transcend. Inclusion is inclusion, and there is no one size fits all. Is really, it really is context specific, and not even just between one country and another and one culture in that sense. It really can be from one club to another club as well. And there was another point. To really involve the people you want to include, and of course throughout this webinar and even in the next two topics that we're talking about, we're going to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cabora. Any of our panelists have any questions or comments you'd like to jump in with? Yeah, go ahead, just go and just unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you prefer us to come in and maybe add a couple of things after, but I guess just to say a little quick thing about recruiting women and girls as well to martial arts. So we know that, for example, that because martial arts have and often are conventionally seen as something which is quite masculine, it's imagined, because it's related to fighting, it's imagined to be something that men would do, then often before women and girls start martial arts, they need a little bit of reassurance that there's a place for them within that martial arts club, that it's okay for them to do that martial art. And so before getting women and girls to join the club, one thing which can be quite good for martial arts clubs and martial arts coaches to do is to make sure that there's lots of information on a website or a Facebook page for that club, because research shows that women are much more likely to thoroughly research before joining any type of sport. They're much more likely to really research a sport first before joining a club, just because they want to, it's about reassuring themselves that there's a place for them, that it's okay for women to join that sport and to build up their confidence and how comfortable they feel in starting. So just in Anna's presentation there, it just really made me think at that point that women prefer to learn a little bit more about a martial art before joining. So if any of you are coaches, then that's something to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that comment. Go ahead, Dr. Chinda.
Yeah, I just want to follow up because I think that's a great point. And I remember it really resonates with my own experiences getting into boxing. I remember it was a really simple thing, but in the advertisement in the newspaper, it said, boxing is a great sport for girls. We have a lot of girls in the club, and we love to see girls come for the boxing school, and that alone was really helpful for me when I was a teenager and didn't know anything about martial arts or about boxing. So sometimes it can be really small things that can at least get girls to come across the threshold and into the club, and then the real work starts, of course, like Anna highlighted.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this would, this information would probably apply to parents as well of younger children? If the parents themselves aren't inside of the the possibility that, oh, martial arts is for their daughters, it's probably something as well. I know sometimes even in terms of inclusion of people with disabilities, it's an issue that sometimes comes up. Sometimes the parents themselves don't understand the value and the importance of participation for their children with disabilities as well. So it's a strategy there as well. So do you think it's the same for when it comes to children or younger girls?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, Chloe, I didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to say, I think it can be. So I think parents and young girls can also have the same thoughts as, is this a sport or a type of activity that would be suitable for my daughter? Are they going to enjoy that? Are they going to feel like they stand out? Should a daughter do a martial arts? So I think definitely more information available online or on websites is always going to be useful for parents. But interestingly, sometimes parents can be drawn to martial arts because they have daughters and because, so my dad, for example, quite wanted me to do a combat sport because he thought it'd be useful for self-defense. So interestingly, gendered ideas about girls and what we know about violence against women, to be fair, in broader society, sometimes actually because we have daughters, that's sometimes a reason parents want to get their children into martial arts as well.
Yeah, of course.
I'll just say something very briefly on that, Aisling, if that's all right, just to follow on from what the others have said with the recruitment of women and girls into martial arts, particularly as Chloe mentioned, drawing out gender stereotypes and gendered ways of thinking about what people want from activities like this. One thing to be quite mindful of and be careful of for coaches and for other club development officers or governing body development officers is how you go about advertising to women and what kind of information and what kind of images particularly you put on your websites and on your social media to advertise to women. And I think I'll come back to representation at the end as one of the sort of summary points, because I have a feeling it's going to be a feature later. But some of the advertising that I see for some martial arts clubs and some of the clubs that I've been part of, particularly when I was a student, all of the decisions about this were made by men. And the kind of messages they put forward and the images they used of women to put forward clearly were informed by men's views of women rather than women's views of what sport could be and what they would want to get out of it. So rather than a website where there's a gallery of women just training, just being normal members of a club, there would be images of sort of fitness models in boxing gloves. Martial arts is great for your fitness, and you'll look better if you lose weight by doing martial arts. And this kind of thing, this kind of messaging, it needs to be very careful, because you tread too far down this road of trying to advertise martial arts as a feminine thing rather than as a thing that's good for women. We can run afoul of some problems, and there's quite a lot of research in sociology that suggests that women do not respond very well to sexualized images of female athletes or airbrushed and glamorized photos. They're much more likely to identify with and be inspired by images of women actually doing sports. So I think it's very important to think about this when we're promoting our clubs, our federations, to think about the authenticity of the messages that we're putting forward about what martial arts can be and do for women.
Great point. Absolutely. And that was referenced as well, the sexualization that you'd referenced, Dr. Cabrera. And I was going to come back to, you'd mentioned that just some of the things, the issues that might hurt the clubs or the federations, their ability to recruit. Would you like to say a little bit more about that, Dr. Cabrera? Do you have any examples? Sometimes if there's an example or something that sometimes you can't see the trees for the forest, if that's an expression you understand. You're just doing it the way that you're doing it, and the way it's always been done. So you're living inside of this paradigm of how it's been done, and then all of a sudden you might, some examples. Sometimes when you hear an example of how some practices that clubs or federations might be doing that are actually impeding inclusion of women and girls. I'm wondering, do you have any examples you could share with our audience?
I think the example that Dr. Shannon just gave about like the messages that we throw in and the ways that we promote our practice was like very to the point, that I wanted to follow up on that sometimes like the same formats or the same way of organizing can have very different effects depending on whether we have reflected on this or not. So like something that like an example that I often like to use is like the use of the color pink. Like yeah, Dr. Shannon and his colleagues have written about that, about the pink gloves. But the use of the color pink. So if we think how to promote our activities to women, and we have like men in the decision making only, and we think, oh, what women and girls like? Pink. Let's make a pink, I don't know, like logo or advertisement picture. Then we just end up like reproducing a stereotype. But if we say that we are women and we are going to take this pink that is like considered, I don't know, like feminine and not very much linked to fighting, we are going to take this color and take like all these like femininity characteristics and like change the meaning and show them that the pink gloves can still give the black eyes coating, like Dr. Shannon and his colleagues again. So I'm not sure if I really answered the question that you asked, but I really wanted to to say this example.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Does anybody have any other comments or questions, or are we ready for the next topic? Yeah, so the next topic, we have Dr. Chloe Mclean coming in. She's going to speak a little more about coaching women. So take the floor whenever you're ready, Dr. Mclean.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just sharing my screen now, so hopefully you can see my screen as well now. So thanks very much to Anna for giving us an introduction to recruiting women and girls to martial arts. Now let's look at the next step. Once we've recruited women and girls to our martial arts clubs, how do we go about coaching women and girls? So first question, which I think is important to address, even if it seems maybe a little bit simplistic, is, does sex matter? Does the sex of our participants actually matter for coaching our martial arts? So does the fact of women's biologies and girls' biologies, does that affect our coaching in martial arts, or should it affect our coaching? And there's a bit of a yes and a no to this. So mostly no, mostly because men and women are equally capable of performing the combative moves involved in martial arts. They're equally capable of and worthy of learning these moves and of learning self-defense, which is the sort of origin of a lot of martial arts. It's a self-defense origin, and self-defense is something that is promoted as something that everybody should be able to do. So in terms of the physical practices within martial arts, women and men are capable of doing it. And unlike some sports, for most martial arts, there's a non-gendered criteria of what men and women do within the practice. So what I mean by that is that whatever the system is within karate, within judo, within taekwondo, etc., women and men are asked to perform the same moves to receive their next color of belt that they receive. We're all asked to perform the same techniques. Whereas in some sports, we might think of, for example, gymnastics, women are given different activities to do than male gymnasts are given to do. And we can see that in the Olympics competition, that it's different routines that men and women perform. Now, there isn't actually a sex basis for that, but nonetheless, martial arts have non-gendered criteria for what we do. So therefore, when women and girls come into our martial arts clubs, there's not an issue there. What is, in terms of biology, what makes a bigger difference in terms of practitioners' experiences and how they might train and who they might train with, is height and weight. These are often much better indicators of who's going to make a good training partner for us, or as a coach, who you might want to pair people up with. It might be more appropriate to do that on a height and a weight basis. So what we're saying here is that, does women's biological sex matter for practicing martial arts? Broadly speaking, no. like I said, okay, there are some ways in which sex does matter for coaching martial arts, and that coaches should be aware of some biological functions of women and girls so that we can enable them and support them to maintain their practice. So first thing that we might want to think about here is menstruation, or when women are on their period. So here they're going to bleed for maybe 5 to 7 days, but menstruation doesn't only come with bleeding, it also comes with painful cramps, headaches, fatigue, anxiety, and unfortunately stigma. And there's stigma across most cultures to do with menstruation, which means that women and girls and societies more broadly often don't talk about it. It remains taboo, and therefore women are encouraged to feel embarrassed when they're experiencing their period or menstruation. And this is damaging in all areas of life for women, because this is a natural process which is going to happen to them, that they have to deal with but are not allowed to talk to, or not allowed, but are stigmatized around talking about. But in martial arts, it has particular, it can lead to particular difficulties. So when women are on their period, they might experience a little bit of a dip in their performance because they might be experiencing a lot of pain, for example. So I know people that have fainted because the pain they're experiencing while on their period is extremely sore. And so it's useful as a martial arts coach to just be aware that that might be going on in some of the women or girls that you're coaching. And so if you see a dip in their performance, just be aware that it could be in relation to something like a period. Some good practices to support women and girls who might be experiencing their period in your martial arts clubs can be simple little things like keeping a sanitary product kit within your first aid kit. So that can mean that should somebody within your class happen to start their period while they're there, it means that they could still continue to do that class, that they don't have to turn away and go home, or feel that they have to turn away and go home. A lot of martial arts wear a white uniform, in which case, if there was to be a leak, then the blood can show very prominently on the kit, and therefore you might want to also think about having a flexible clothing policy, which means that participants could choose to wear things such as leggings or jogging bottoms of a darker colour at some of your classes, which again might make women and girls who are experiencing their period feel a little bit more comfortable, so that if there was a leak, then it's less visible. So it means that they're more likely to keep attending your class while they're experiencing their period, as some women and girls won't attend a class if they're experiencing their period, or these worries about period blood showing, and then the worries about how other people might react to that due to the stigma and taboo that is often around periods. And I would say that if you feel comfortable within your own cultural context to do so, it's also good to be vocal that you do have sanitary products in your first aid kit, because that can also normalize periods and normalize talking about periods to your practitioners. Again, making women and girls feel a little bit more comfortable. Menopause is another issue which women in their sort of 40s and 50s and maybe their 60s might experience, and this can include experiences of hot flushes, headaches, forgetfulness, anxiety, and reduced muscle mass. And again, this can lead to a fluctuating performance. So you might notice that some women have stopped in the middle of their practice because they've forgotten what comes next. Or it might just be that you've seen a little bit of a dip in how well they're performing at certain times. This could be due to the menopause. And so when thinking about how we can support women and girls who are experiencing the menopause, things like opening windows and doors where appropriate can be useful for getting a little bit of fresh air in to help with the hot flushes. Thinking about supportive rather than punishing forms of practice when we see our women and girls dipping in performance, because this might be related to the menopause, and so it's not that they're not trying, but it could be a physical issue that they're experiencing at that moment in time. And another way to normalise women's experience, women's bodily experience, might be to promote the benefits of martial arts for menopause. So there's a lot of research out there that shows that physical activity can help minimise some of the more negative experiences that women have, some of the negative symptoms of menopause like headaches, hot flushes, etc. It's quite useful to promote and vocally emphasise this to your members, because this can, one, help encourage again more members to join or continue their practice, but also two, it can help normalise women's bodies within martial arts settings. And the last one I'll touch on here just now as well is eating disorders. So eating disorders can happen to men or women, but women doing martial arts are at an increased risk of developing an eating disorder, because many martial arts have weight categories if martial artists are going to go into competition. So that can unfortunately lead to disordered eating. And also women have, across many societies, in fact most societies, they experience quite strong feminine beauty ideals, and often these beauty ideals are based on achieving a certain weight. In the West, for example, it's often a very slender figure. And so that combination of feminine beauty ideals alongside weight categories in sport can lead women and girls to be at increased risk of eating disorders, which can lead to things in the future, such as early onset osteoporosis, which is a bone density, a weakening of bone density, a very severe illness. So good practices, again, to avoid body shaming. We talked a bit about this when we're thinking about how we advertise our classes. So maybe don't want to advertise our classes as for losing weight, because that focus on the body can unintentionally lead to disordered eating practices, particularly amongst women. So avoiding body shaming, avoiding mentioning really practitioners' body weight, discouraging practitioners from trying to cut weight to fight within a lower weight category, and emphasising the importance of skill over weight and size. Now, other things we could have talked about here is about pregnancy, for example, pre and post, and how women come back to sport after that. There's too much to talk about, so much to talk about, so not enough time today, but hopefully this gives a little bit of an indication of the ways in which sex does and doesn't matter for coaching women and girls. What is more important in terms of coaching women and girls really is the impact of gender. So ideas about how women and girls should be in society have much more prominent impact into women and girls' experiences within martial arts settings and how they overcome some of them. So a lot of the expectations, again, each culture has a specific set of ideas about what it is to be a woman and what that should involve, but some characteristics which tend to stretch across most cultures include that women should look pretty and friendly. There's an expectation that women should be caring, that they should put others first, and that they should take up little space, that they should really be quite small and make room for others. Now, these types of gendered expectations, which women might experience in lots of different areas of their life, come into conflict with some of the expectations of what we do in martial arts. So while society might want women to look pretty and friendly, in martial arts, we want them to show aggression. While society wants women to be caring, in martial arts, we want them to hit people. When society wants women to put others first, martial arts want them to prioritise their time spent doing the martial art. And we can think here particularly about mothers and how mothers often prioritise children or their partners over spending time for themselves, to dedicate time to engage in a hobby for themselves. So often we see a big dip in women's participation in sport at the age that they might be a mother. And also expectations for women and girls to take up little space comes in direct contrast to what we want them to do in the martial arts settings, which is to move, to shout, to throw, to smell, to start sweating and smell quite bad. These are things which come into conflict with conventional expectations of what women and girls should be across a lot of different cultural settings. So when women and girls practice martial arts, I would argue that this, and lots of research by my colleagues here on this call, argues that it can actually be a very good experience for women and girls because there's space to move beyond what is expected of women and girls, to engage in activities and practices which are not expected of women and girls, such as being aggressive, learning to put themselves first, learning to take up space and be vocal about what they want to do. So practicing martial arts can challenge some parts of conventional ideas about what it is to be a woman, and that can increase women's skill sets and increase the opportunities for them to live their lives and perform their lives as they might want to. So got a last slide here about mixed sex training versus women only training. So this is something to think about as a coach, and as Anna alluded to in her previous set of slides as well. So I've put up some small set of arguments for either, and I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about this at the end because it seems to be appearing a few times. So some arguments for mixed sex practice are that martial arts have a universal curriculum, or a curriculum that both men and women are expected to do. We're expected to do the same thing, so why not train together? Other arguments include that it challenges men and women's assumptions about women's capacities, and that therefore that is good for creating greater gender equality. And also that the segregation of women and men in martial arts can reinforce ideas of the women's classes as inferior to men's classes. Arguments for women-only practice is that women and girls can be put off by masculine stereotypes and therefore might not join a class if it's mixed sex only. So if you provide a women's only class, that might be the only way to get some women to join a martial art in the first place. That these can be supportive spaces, and they're experienced as supportive spaces by women for breaking gender stereotypes together. And also that survivors of male violence or some religious women might feel uncomfortable or unable to train with men, and therefore a women's only coaching space provides a place where these women could train. So these are some considerations, and I'm sure we'll come back to this discussion. But what is important in deciding whether it's mixed sex or single sex is thinking about the cultural context and what type of women you're targeting or wanting to introduce to your sport. So I'll stop sharing now, and I look forward to sharing the discussion with the colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mclean. Fantastic, fantastic presentation. There's a lot, I think in such a short time, you addressed so many of the, I guess, I would imagine the questions that come up for every coach, especially a male coach, when it comes to how to actually coach women and girls. I'm so glad you address those conversations which are often considered taboo, especially the menstruation and menopause and even the eating disorders. It's really fantastic information for anybody, and even the socio-cultural context and the expectations that are on women in society in general. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I have a couple of questions, but I'm wondering would any of the other panelists like to jump in if you have any comments or questions? Anything you'd like to add?
I completely agree. I think the points you made, Chloe, about biology, about menstrual cycle, it really needs more attention. It should be integrated into coach education programs. It should be taken into consideration when planning training cycles, especially for elite athletes. For instance, I've taken all the coach certifications nationally and internationally, there is nothing about women's biology, menstruation, injury prevention, these really important issues. I would suspect that many martial arts education programs for coaches do not address these types of issues, and therefore coaches do not have the knowledge they need to really help their female elite athletes, especially, reach the top levels they can.
Yeah, really great point there, Dr. Chundal. And you know what I heard as well, a lot of in what you shared, Dr. Mclean, is really about creating this supportive environment. You know, the knowledge is power. So the more any coaches understands what their martial artists might be experiencing, and to try and put themselves inside of their shoes, you know, with empathy, with that understanding, you can actually create a much more supportive environment that even comes back to the retention as well. You know, of course, if women feel included and they feel like they're understood, they're more likely to enjoy the experience, and even if these considerations are considered as well, even be even more successful as well, I would imagine. So I'm conscious of the time, and I think we had discussed that there's a potential we will go over time here. So we're probably going to go over the hour by about 15 minutes or so, and just for each of our attendees, just to let you know and be aware of that. And if you have to leave and drop off after the hour, you know, you can follow up with the recording. As I said, it'll be on YouTube, and we'll also be sending it out to you. But I'm wondering, does anybody else have any other comments or questions here, or should we move on to the next topic?
Let me add something just very quickly.
Yeah, please.
Thank you for the great presentation, Chloe. As I was listening to you, and I was thinking of the coaching style, the importance also of the coaching style in creating the supportive environment, because I recently came across some research about the effects that different coaching styles had on athletes or practitioners' motivation to continue, not only with their sport, but also with education. It was a dual career research, the one that I am talking about. And the results were that coaches that showed more affect in their coaching style were creating were better creating this supportive environment, and it was like linked to athletes continuing with their practice. So like educating coaches on how to show more affect.
Fantastic. Yeah, emotional intelligence, isn't it, really, and that person-centered approach, and connecting, I suppose, connecting with your players. Thank you, and thank you everybody for your input. And so this moves us to our next topic, which we're actually naturally, there's been a natural build up. We're almost coming there naturally anyway, which is pathways for women in leadership. So coming back to you, Dr. Chundal, and all of your expertise on that in this domain.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. Do you see the presentation? Yeah. Okay, I'll try to keep it to 7-8 minutes. Talking about pathways for women in leadership roles. I have 3 main themes or points that I would like to bring to this webinar and to the discussion. The first is about policies and strategies. The second is about the pitfalls and potentials of women-centered leadership programs, which ties into both the presentation of Chloe and Anna. And the third point is on the importance of men as change agents. So beginning with the most complex thing, with policies and strategies, there are different ways that martial arts and other sport organizations can go about making pathways for women in leadership roles. Some other scholars, Jorid Hovden, Agnes Elling, and Annelies Noppers, who are sport sociologists, they call 2 main approaches, the individual track and the structural track. And these 2 approaches that sport organizations often work under when they try to promote women in leadership. They are different in terms of framing the problem, in terms of policy aim, and in terms of strategy. So martial art clubs or other sport organizations within the individual track, they often see gender inequalities as an individual problem. And this means that they diagnose the problem in a way that women as individuals lack resources and competence to compete with men on equal terms for leadership positions. Sport organizations within the structural track, on the other hand, they think of gender inequalities as an organizational problem, and therefore their diagnosis is that informal and formal discrimination and processes of exclusion is the main issue that limits women's advancement in leadership. And these different understandings of what the problem is also lead to different policy aims and strategies. In the individual track, sport organizations' main goal is to recruit more women. But in the structural track, the policy aim is to ensure gender equality and fairness within the organization. And this means that strategies in the individual track, they are often centered around the development of the individual woman, while strategies in the structural track are centered or based on structural measures. And a well-known example of this would be the introduction of gender quotas for leadership, which Norway is quite famous for. So the individual track and the structural track, they represent two different approaches or ways of thinking about creating pathways for women in leadership roles in martial arts and in other sport organizations. And this theoretical framing brings us into the second point, which is women-centered leadership programs. This is a very well-used strategy to advance women in leadership roles, such as coaching, management, board of directors, refereeing, and so on. And especially in sport organizations that fall within the individual track. And despite the fact that these programs are often used as a strategy to recruit and develop women in sport leadership, there are several pitfalls with women-only programs. The main one is that they often tend to reinforce gender stereotypes that women lack knowledge, skills, and competence. In other words, that they are not equal to men. They need something else, something extra in order to compete with men for the leadership positions. A second pitfall is that they often overlook gendered hierarchies and power relations in the specific sport and the specific leadership role, for instance, coaching. So they tend to overlook the structural and organizational barriers that women face. And lastly, many of these women-centered leadership programs, what happens is that after the program is finished, the number of women drops down again. So they often struggle with retention. They might recruit more women into leadership for a short time, but then when the program ends, it's back to square one. However, there are many opportunities with these types of programs, of course, in addition to allowing women to develop leadership skills, whether it be coaching or other management roles. Mainly, it gives women a community and a safe space where they can share experiences as women leaders in martial arts. So it could be a good area to develop community and support among women leaders. It's also a good way to educate on the risks and challenges that many women leaders face in male-dominated sport organizations and leadership. So for new women coming into leadership roles for the first time, they might not be prepared for some of the cultural and structural barriers that they may face. And thirdly, it can be a good platform to discuss gendered power relations and gender distributions of leadership tasks and other issues. So I just wanted to advertise Leanne Norman's new book for those of you who are interested in coaching. It just came out earlier this month, Improving Gender Equity in Sport Coaching. It has several chapters from different sports on women-centered leadership programs in coaching. And together with Jorid Hovden, I've written one chapter there evaluating one of the or one such program from boxing coaches. So to the last point that I would like to make, which is on the importance of men as change agents. If you take a look at this group photo on this slide, it's from my own coach examination with the International Boxing Federation. And I remember going there, the instructor said in all his years as an instructor, he had never seen so many women in a boxing coach certification course. And here we are 3 women and 15 men. So the point I want to make with this photo is, if we are going to talk about pathways for women in leadership roles in martial arts, we have to talk about men. Men constitute the majority in almost all decision-making boards and committees in sport. This means that men play a key role in the advancement of gender diversity and democracy in sport leadership in the future. Any strategy to create change therefore requires that more men become involved in the drive to increase gender diversity in sport governance. Alliances of women with men are a necessity today and in the future to secure pathways for women in leadership roles in martial arts and in other sports. So for any aspiring women leaders in martial arts listening, my tip would be find your male allies, because you need them. So I think I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Tyndall. And for all those men out there, I hope you're listening. I hope you're pulling up your socks. We women need you to support inclusion. Thank you so much for that presentation. Really fantastic. And I popped the link to that book, actually. I did a quick Google. So the link is in the chat as well for anyone who's watching live. And I'll pop it at the end slide as well for anyone watching the recording. So I'm mindful of the time. So rather than coming in here, because I know, Dr. Shannon, you're going to pull everything together and summarize a lot of what we've said here. So are you ready? Would you like to jump in? Are you ready?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just share my screen.
Thank you.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry, I just need to jump back to the meeting. Okay, is the single slide showing now?
Yes, I'm seeing tension between ideals, that slide.
Lovely. Okay, so as we've been talking, I've just scribbled down 4 sort of overarching points, which I think you might have got a spoiler on as I scrolled through and tried to bring it up there. 4 points that I think should tie together most of what we've just been talking about. The first point is that there is a generalized tension between ideals of femininity and martial arts practice, particularly, even though this is going to vary by culture, it's going to vary across generations, it's going to vary according to lots of different factors. What tends to be the case in most of the research that we have on this topic around the world is that there are various different contradictions, tensions, problems between what women are supposed to do in society and what martial arts requires of them. And that's been touched on by each of the other 3 presenters. The first sort of sub point there that I've put, ignoring this is not going to resolve problems. So expecting women to turn up and just get on with it and, integrate themselves into existing clubs, forge ahead with their leadership and coaching careers and so on, that's not going to resolve the issue. So, gender shouldn't matter here. It shouldn't be an issue for martial arts practice. It shouldn't get in the way of people's career progression. It shouldn't be a barrier to participation, but it is in various different ways. So we need to recognize that. And I think to come back to Dr. Chundor's last point, men have to recognize this as well, particularly given that, and I speak as a man who's lived this out, over several years. It's not necessarily something that's a problem for us personally. It's not something that men have experienced. Certainly when we're dealing with some of the issues that Dr. Mclean talked about around menstruation and pregnancy and so on. These are issues obviously that we're never going to experience personally, but equally things to do with gender expectations. So we can't expect these problems to go away without recognizing that they exist as a starting point, and then proactively working to try and reduce this tension. And that that proactive work is going to take various forms. We've heard quite a few already today of ways that we might move forwards and try and overcome and tackle these boundaries, these barriers rather, and promote women and girls' inclusion and success and excellence in martial arts. They're likely to be culturally specific, the way we actually try and implement them. I think briefly, Dr. Mclean mentioned mixed sex training as being potentially problematic for some women, but being brilliant for others. So, these things are not going to, these strategies that we use to overcome these problems aren't going to work all the time in every kind of situation. So recognizing that there is this tension and that we should take it seriously and do something about it, I think is the first sort of overarching point to take home here. Secondly, women's specific needs deserve attention, very much connected to the first point really, but I really want to drive home this point that if martial arts are generally seen as masculine activities, they're generally male dominated in most, most clubs tend to have more men than women. Most of the time men are leading these clubs, leading these federations. When women enter these spaces, they shouldn't be just treated as honorary men, right? You're here with the men doing the men's thing, welcome, be part of it, just get on with it kind of attitude. Women have specific needs. They have particular issues that need to be addressed. They have particular problems that men might not have. And those need to be addressed in their own right if women are going to succeed and excel. Now, the final point on the slide, again, to sort of reiterate from the previous presentation, male coaches probably haven't experienced these things personally themselves. They're likely to lack direct experience and to empathize and to sort of guess at these things and to get out ahead of it just purely on their own merits is probably not going to happen. So a great thing for federations, for bodies that develop sport in various different countries, is to think about coach education and think about placing these kinds of issues, female specific problems, gender issues that men are not likely to have experienced, placing these firmly within the coach education curricula. As well as that, which we'll come on to in just a moment, the increasing prominence of women in leadership positions so that women are making decisions and are part of the process for tackling these issues, rather than always having it being left up to the men, is going to be very helpful and very useful. So acknowledging that women have specific needs in these kind of contexts that need to be taken seriously is quite important with respect to meeting the first point. Thirdly, as I mentioned the first time I chipped in, representation, and this sort of connects quite nicely with the recruitment of women, but also around things like media representation of female athletes. So for federations that are trying to promote audiences for their female fighters and so on, think about how we can represent women in martial arts in a genuine and authentic way that centers on, as I've put there, girls and women's actual experiences. So not a male image of what female martial arts is supposed to look like, not a man's idea of women in martial arts, but actually what women themselves want to say, want to see in order to accurately represent them, but also to encourage and motivate others to join and take part. And they should also be aspirational. So images that and representations of women in martial arts that center on the ambitions held by girls and women for their development, as we've talked about with those other points as well. So representation, very important in terms of communicating a positive and forward-thinking developmental message about what martial arts can be in girls and women's lives. And lastly, really just to sort of, as Dr. Chandor was talking, I already had this written down, and she's mentioned all of these points. So just to reiterate them really, women being in leadership positions, having ownership, being able to direct things, being able to place these issues very firmly on the agenda, rather than leaving it up to the men all the time. Men in these positions of power need to recognize that women should be part of this conversation. It's very important that we proactively help women ourselves, but also give them space, give them a voice, give them a hand on the steering wheel. Let's get more than just 3 out of 15 people on a coaching course. Let's get to a position where women are actually able to solve these problems on behalf of other women and girls. Particularly when it comes to the topics we've talked about today, I think recruiting, retaining and coaching women to recognize those specific, unique issues that men are likely to have never encountered. The final point that I'd sort of close on, women's voices in policy is very important, but one thing to think about, if anyone from any club, federation and so on is here, women have more to say than just things about gender and things about women and girls inclusion. One of the most frustrating things about gender inclusion policies is that they tend to be written in response to a directive from a larger body. So a funding body will say, you need to have a gender policy. So if you go and you write a gender policy, and the gender inclusion policy is separate from and different to all of the other policies, and it's written on its own terms in its own little space, if the perspective that informs that policy isn't represented in other things that your federations and your clubs are doing, then you're likely to have tensions between the goals of that policy to improve access for women and girls and all the other things that are already being done and have been done by your federation. So, having women in these positions of leadership is very important, not just in terms of answering the gender question, but also making sure that the rest of what we're doing in martial arts is facilitating that and is conducive to good representation, to increased accessibility and so on and so on. So those are my sort of 4 take home, hopefully useful and helpful to sort of tie everything together. And I think I can stop talking now.
I think that was an absolutely beautiful summary. Very, very well said. I'm so inspired by this conversation. I'm actually covered in goosebumps all throughout. So thank you so much, Dr. Shannon, for that lovely summary, and to each of our panelists. There's comments in the chats about, so many people really loving your presentations. So thank you each. There is a question here. I know we're at the 15 minutes, we're gone over, but there is a quick question. I'm just wondering, can we take it? It's from Stephanie Stevens. She said actually it's more for the Q&A, the final Q&A session. So we'll leave that for there, Stephanie. And thank you for the question. I'm going to save that. So just as we were talking about the Q&A session, so the final session of the whole webinar series, the 10th session, it's a live Q&A, is on September the 7th from 1 to 2 p.m. Universal time. And so we have some various speakers from the different panels who have sat throughout. And I just want to say, as we bring this webinar 9 to a close, I really, from the bottom of my heart, really want to thank each of our panelists once again, Dr. Kavura, Dr. Mclean, Dr. Chandal, and Dr. Shannon. Obviously, we couldn't be here without you, and each of your presentations were so packed full of information. For such short presentations, there was a lot in there to cover that you each covered, and I'm so grateful, and thank you for being with us. So as I said, you can connect with each of our panelists on Twitter. They're all of their Twitter handles are in the chat, and they'll also be on the final slide if you're watching the recording. I also wish to thank each of our attendees for joining us and for your engagement, for your comments throughout. We're so happy to see such interest in this conversation of inclusion. It's really, because there's a wider movement. It's not just in martial arts, the whole sports sector. There's real drive at the moment for inclusion. And so it's so happy to feel the movement is alive. I think that's the goosebumps I'm feeling, is like this movement is alive, and it's happening through each of us. So thank you each and everybody. And of course, thank you UNESCO ICM for facilitating this in collaboration with us here at the UNESCO chair. So with that being said, thank you once again to everybody. And we wish you such a wonderful, wonderful day. And maybe our paths will all cross again on our journey towards inclusive practice. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.